Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to talk about regret, remorse, and resentment, the 3 R's of misery. Okay. So I want to just talk about how I think about each one of those first, and then I'll address some of the questions that Christy compiled for me that are coming from the group, from the Asking LDS Marriage and Sexuality Therapist group. So let's start with remorse. So remorse is a feeling, it's when we feel bad about a bad thing that we've done. It's the emotion we feel when we confront that our behavior is not in line with our ideals or the kind of person that we respect, right? And it's a very, very valuable emotion, even though it's an uncomfortable one, because remorse always moves you forward. So remorse is like, I don't like that I've done that, and I am going to do that differently. I am not proud of that behavior, and I have to do better. And so it's really measured by new action. It isn't measured by feeling bad about yourself or feeling you're a terrible person. You may feel some of those feelings, but the measure is really in changing and acknowledging that's not okay with me to indulge in that behavior or to treat somebody that way. I have to do better. So it leads to change. And, a remorseful person, they confront their limited thinking or their limited behavior, and they move forward in a better way. So it's a product of humility and a willingness to grow. So remorse is a very pro-social behavior, and it has a lot to do with our own response to our own behavior. Regret is perhaps a little bit tougher of an emotion, right? Regret is wishing, despite being powerless to do anything about it, that you had chosen differently. It's the inability to forgive yourself for your limited self, for the limitations you had in the past. Perhaps that's limitations in your understanding. Perhaps it was self-deception that you can now see. Perhaps it was arrogance, maybe ignorance, maybe even just you want to believe you could have chosen better, but in reality, you just didn't know what you know now. You didn't know not to buy a house then. You didn't know the market was about to crash, right? But you can live in this regret that somehow, you could have or should have somehow known to do differently. And so it's really, regret is kind of the inability, there's remorse, but when it turns into regret, it's more like you have a hard time forgiving yourself for it. It's like this inability to tolerate or forgive that you were at the level of development or understanding in a past situation, and it's very hard to tolerate the consequences of it, right? So it's a very understandable emotion. You're just like, dang it, like, why couldn't I have done differently? Why couldn't I have chosen? Why couldn't I have seen? It's when we start fantasizing about time machines and so on, like, just somehow take the knowledge you have now and go back in time and what you would have done differently. And it's a very understandable thing because we're living in a world with limited knowledge, limited understanding, and we have to live in the consequences of our choices. And so we are very often trying to make decisions without the information that we really wish we had. And so to regret, certainly makes sense. But I think that overcoming regret has a lot to do with learning to live life on life's terms. It's like forgiving the fact, or tolerating the fact that we are limited human beings in a limited world, and we don't have another way, right? As Eve says, is there no other way? There's not. Okay. We can and should learn from our mistakes, right? Remorse, right? And we can even sanctify, in a sense, our past errors by learning from them, creating something better from it. It's a way of making that error holier. It's because it allows something truer, clearer minded, kinder, more loving to happen out of that growth. And, repentance is a sacred process. It is a process of learning from our mistakes, learning from the things that we do, because we're getting wiser and more able to handle an uncertain world. But it can be hard for us to forgive the fact that we're in an uncertain world and that we are imperfect people that are in a process of learning. And so regret can often be the fantasy that somehow I shoulda, coulda, if I had tried harder, prayed harder, something. I mean, we often don't go follow through on this. Like, what is the thing that I really could have or should have done then? Often we don't know. And so I think we want a world, all of us, and I understand it myself, that we could get away from that process, from that reality, right? Follow all the rules and everything will turn out for us. And there is truth in that idea, right? If you can learn from the wisdom of those that have gone before you, you can avoid a life burdened by constant regret, right? You can borrow the mistakes, you can learn from the mistakes others have made ahead of you. But you can't avoid it altogether. You just don't have enough information to get out of the vulnerability of being human. So we have to go through that difficult process and learn through error and through agency, and forgive life, forgive ourselves for the fact of this, right? If you're honest with yourself, if you had known then what you know now, you would have chosen differently. You just didn't yet know it. And there probably, often wasn't a way to know it in the mind that you were in at the time. Right? We want to put our mind back into our younger mind. But that's just not where it was. We've come to our current mind by going through the consequences of some of those choices. And so it's just, I get it, it's hard, but it's in a way living with some tolerance and compassion for ourselves, trying to work out our way in a deeply imperfect world. So I think if you can't forgive yourself, on some level, you're engaging in a form of self-hatred, right? A kind of self-rejection. You can't accept your younger self that didn't know better. You can't accept your younger self that was arrogant, or, thought they were above the rules, or thought that, this was a great choice or something. And I really think it can be valuable if you're living in some constant regret. A lot of times we just think, if I could just somehow go change it, okay, but we have to recognize at some point, like that is not an option that exists. And so how do I come to peace with the fact that I made decisions I wish I hadn't, and perhaps I'm living in the consequences of some of those? I think it can help to be in some kind of conversation with your younger self, with your more naive self, with your more arrogant self, whatever it is, and understand where he or she was at that point, to understand why you weren't able to make a different choice yet. And to offer some compassion to that self. It's also a way to offer compassion to all of us when we do that we're stumbling through life and often not learning until we've had to suffer some consequences that have been painful for us. And you can learn from that younger self. What was the error in my thinking then, right? What do I need to take from that experience to do differently now? What, if anything? And, I think that can help you to make peace with the process that we're all in. I don't know anyone who doesn't have some regrets in their life. And some obviously have bigger regrets. Some obviously have paid higher prices for their missteps. But often those who have made big mistakes have understandable reasons for having made them. That doesn't mean like, oh, it doesn't matter, or that, there was no other possibility. But to understand what was the mindset that I was in and what made that seem like the right thing to do. And I just think it can really help us if we can engage in some self-understanding, some younger self-understanding, and in the reality of where we actually were, not the fantasy that we want to have, that we should have known everything. That can help us to move on. Okay, I'm going to come back to all these true questions, but I'm going to give you just one more, which is resentment. Resentment is different than anger. You know, somebody defined it as, what is it? Resentment is drinking poison and hoping somebody else dies, right? It, it's different than anger. It's different than frustration or disappointment, right? It's literally resentment, like to refeel. It's to refeel or resense our, our anger about something. So you live the anger over and over when you think about it. And we often do this as a way to manage the disappointment we have. We wanted something perhaps that was a legitimate thing to want, but we didn't get it. We wanted a partner who was more sensitive, who was faithful, who was, more sensitive to your feelings, and you didn't get it. It doesn't mean that what you wanted was necessarily wrong or a bad thing to want, but the person who disappointed you, or the entity that disappointed you, right, that it's going back to the sense of your powerlessness relative to that person's choices, and just reliving the anger that the situation wasn't more fair, that it wasn't kinder to you, that you didn't get what you desired, as legitimate as that was. And resentment is different than anger because it's more of a pattern of thinking, right? It's that you go to the anger, the resentment, the refeeling of the frustration as a way of coping. And so it's not just a one-time decision, I'm just going to forgive, or I've got to stop feeling resentment. You have to actually confront a pattern of thinking and confront that pattern of thinking. And as I often say, resentment is sort of making decisions, but handing the responsibility of those decisions over to someone else. It's making yourself powerless in your life or in your relationship and continuing to blame the other person for your sense of powerlessness. It's a tempting thing to do, because really taking responsibility for our lives, even when we've been deeply disappointed, even when we thought life was going to work out one way and we realized that wasn't the pattern in fact at all, or we were misled in some form, it can be really hard to kind of step up and take deeper responsibility, and can be easy to get stuck in, if you had done XYZ, I would be in a different place. And while there's truth in that, and I'm certainly not going to be encouraging anybody in these questions to deny your feelings of anger, frustration, disappointment, hurt, it's important to acknowledge what you don't like about what happened and what the problem is with it. But to not just live in the victimhood of the sort of superior victim position, because it's a way of not actually stepping up and taking deeper responsibility for our lives. We get caught in the kind of idea that I would be happy if it weren't for you. And so I get to feel quietly superior because you deprived me of something, but it's highly related to depression and low feelings of self-worth, because you are in that meaning stripping yourself of your own power. If we're living resentfully around something, we're in a pattern of not taking control or responsibility for our lives. Okay. So that's the intro of just ways to think about this. And then I'm just going to go through some of the questions that Christy has asked. And if you have follow-up questions or you need me to clarify something, you can put it in the chat and Christy will catch it and hopefully and say something. So, okay. This person says, what if the thing I have remorse about is some of the ways that I showed up after taking my deep dive into the world of JFF? It really opened my mind up to a lot and showed me my resentments more clearly. But that made me kind of a jerk in some ways for a time. Lots happened during that time that really hurt my wife and me, and these hurts still seem to resurface on both of our parts. What wisdom would you impart to those of us who regret the messy ways we have attempted to live the principles you teach? Well, first of all, I would say it's not an unusual pattern. Sometimes if somebody's like in the nice guy syndrome, or you're in the, as a woman, in this kind of one down pleasing, I'll kind of try to make you happy with me, and you start to wake up to it. A lot of times we go from a one down position to a one up position. It's like, oh yeah, you know, not anymore. Okay, like I've given way too much and now it's my time to get, and we can kind of handle, how to say it, we hear that like somebody's been taking advantage of us, and we now get to take advantage in return in the name of growth. And it's not an unusual response. I don't know how many people avoid some version of that at first, because it's kind of waking up and you feel some anger. And you feel some anger at yourself, if you're completely honest, that you've maybe been complicit in a more one down, self-effacing, self-denying reality. But it's easier to kind of put your anger on factors outside of you that may have played a role, but you are still the one who went along with, you know, how to say it, like, can't think of the word, but basically pushing down your desires and feelings to keep others happy with you. And so it's, you can go into a superiority, you can kind of take on a kind of entitled victim position, and yeah, it can hurt, and it can, and you can quickly learn, if you're paying attention, like, okay, maybe that isn't it either. I guess what I would say to this person's question, and what's wisdom you'd impart for those of us who regret the messy ways we have attempted to live the principle? Well, because there is no other way. Eve said it best, okay? We learn through acting in the world. We learn through making choices. And then when we live in those choices and we live in the consequences of those choices, we either say like, that's helpful, my life is expanding, or oops, that's still not it. Okay, that actually, you know, I can see my self-deception in that. I can see the error of my thinking in that. There really is no other way. That's why we have agency. That's why we have a body. We're on this planet to act and to learn as we do it. And we sometimes in our interpretation of our theology make it like making mistakes is a bad thing. Okay, what I mean is we treat it like making mistakes is the aberration, right? That if we're just doing what we should and being good children of God, we're not going to make mistakes. And then Christ is not going to suffer on the cross for us. Anyway, he's going to suffer for the other losers out there, but not for us. Okay. And we have this fantasy that we can somehow get out of this process, rather than atonement as literally like compassion from God for the pain and suffering and loss and grief that is a part of this learning, messy process. And, you know, this doesn't mean that there's no value in heeding the commandments, right? Or heeding wise counsel, because you can, if you can internalize and learn from others, you can spare yourself going through unnecessary suffering. But part of having agency is living and acting in the world and choosing, and sometimes choosing well and sometimes choosing not well, and learning how to have compassion for ourselves and others in this process. The very ones that you may resent, okay, are also in a process of learning. They're in a process of making mistakes, and we can get caught in our own superior resentment and so on, as a way of not having compassion for others and ourselves as we're stumbling through and trying to sort out how to be better. Now, there is a difference between, how to say, trusting someone who you can see is in a real process of trying to grow and change, versus, I mean, how to explain this quickly. I'm not saying you shouldn't be awake to the people you're in relationship with, and I don't mean that you should just trust everybody. Okay, that sometime we can talk more about forgiveness, but you know, there's a difference between trusting somebody and forgiving. Forgiving is to not live in resentment, to not live in the seething anger of what someone else did. It's learning how to tolerate that we don't get everything we want, that people will indeed disappoint us, and to learn how to metabolize that and still take control of our lives. That's what forgiveness is, which is different than I trust you or I want you close to me. You may, but it depends a lot on the behavior of the person who offended you at one point. So again, it's forgiving ourselves for being in a process and forgiving your partner for being in a process or anyone else that you love. This person says, I'm 61. I had an awakening a couple years ago and realized all of my traumas are related to the church's programs or teachings. I was super compliant and got married the first time very young. My second husband and I have been married for over 30 years. Because of church teachings, I sacrificed my education so my first husband could get his. I feel that I missed out on self-development, even though I still had a pretty good professional career. I'm trying to take responsibility for working through my resentment by going to school now, but I feel robbed by the leaders of our church. It's hard for me to go full-time for a couple reasons. My husband and I had planned to travel when retired, and I don't want to renege or miss out on that with him. Our kids are having children, and I want to be there with the grandkids when the grandkids are born and to give them love. Lastly, I have an autoimmune condition which reduces how much energy I have for all of these good things. I just feel like I missed out on the social experience, the academic learning, the subsequent achievements, and I'm having a hard time letting go of being mad about it. I don't want to be a victim, but I feel that I could have accomplished more if obstacles hadn't been in the way. Any advice? Okay. Again, it is so hard to live life on life's terms. It really is. I mean, how to say it? So many of us are just born into unfair situations. We're all born on some level into unfair situations, situations in which we don't get what we want. We don't get the guidance, the love, the input, the clarity, the wisdom that would have really benefited our life. And some of us have much more unfair situations than others. And yet we all matter the same. And this is a hard thing about life. This is just deeply unfair. And I have always wanted for that to not be true somehow, like somehow it all isn't true, or, you know, you have a hard situation because, I don't know, you were so valiant in the pre-existence. Something is going to make it all be fair ultimately. But the hard reality is life is unfair. And that some of us got it better than others. And so part of living life well is tolerating this, which is easy to say when you don't have much to forgive, and much harder to do when you have a lot to forgive. Much harder to do when you see other people who don't have to tolerate those same losses. You know, I have clients who came out of relatively abusive families, that they were not given the love, the care, the guidance, the input that they needed, because flawed people were parenting them, teaching them. And it cost them a lot. Perhaps the ability to get a career, perhaps the ability to be in a meaningful, intimate relationship, right? And these aren't small things. These are, you know, you continue to live in the consequences of them, even though you're as worthy of a good life as someone else who's enjoying an easier life. And so again, it's like, how do I tolerate living life on life's terms? How do I not live in resentment for being in an unjust world? That I have to tolerate that I trusted advice or input that did not serve me. Or perhaps it served some things and didn't serve other things. Perhaps it blessed my life in some ways and didn't serve me in other ways, right? I think what the fantasy and resentment is that if I had gotten this thing, I would be so happy now. I would have this amazing career. We would be off, you know, retiring and traveling, and I'd have everything I want. And I mean, I'm not dismissing that entirely because I think there's truth in that, that maybe my life may have well been better if I'd had better input, if I hadn't thought that doing this path was ordained by God and therefore was going to bless me. And so I trusted it too much and it didn't yield what I thought it was going to yield. And I have feelings about that. And I think it is absolutely fair to have feelings about it. And it's fair to say that wasn't good for me. And I'm not going to trust that in the same way that I may have in the past. But it's another thing, and this is going to the question of how we have to challenge our thoughts around resentment. What we often want to say is, if I'd had this, then I would be happy. If I'd had this, then I would have this really good life. And it's denying the good that did come out of where we were. And it's also denying the complexity of life. It doesn't mean there's no truth in it, but we want to be very careful that it's not keeping us from taking deeper responsibility now and accepting the fact that life just doesn't give you everything you want. How do I, the thesis of the Strength of Your Relationship course is how you handle not getting what you want in your marriage determines the kind of marriage you'll have, right? And how you handle not getting what you want in life determines the level of happiness in your life. Okay, can I forgive what I didn't get? Can I have gratitude for what I did get? And how do I move forward in a better way? How do I go forward? That's the only choice I get. And when we get caught in resentment, it's a way of forestalling taking deeper responsibility. It's all understandable. I'm not in any simple judgment here. But it is a way of metabolizing the inherent injustice of life and still self-authoring and living in it deeply. So, Christy, can you remind me of the question that the other person asked around this?
Sure. When we get stuck in the powerless, resentful pattern of thinking, what new thoughts can we use to get out and recognize our true power?
I think, first of all, I don't think you need to begrudge or judge yourself for having feelings about a loss at all. In fact, I think you have to acknowledge it hurts that I didn't get this, right? It's painful that I didn't get the love or the direction or the clarity that I needed, that I wanted, that on some level I deserved. And it's painful for me that that it cost me in X, Y, and Z ways. I think the more you can acknowledge that and own that truth, the better. It's like, this is not about pretending that you didn't suffer a loss. And then, what can I learn from that loss? What do I need to take from that? Here I am, though, in my life. I am 61 or whatever age you are as anyone listening here. What can I respect going forward? What do I need to address? What can I do now to make my life what I can live with dignity? I don't have the choice of going back 40 years. I don't have the choice of marrying differently. I don't have the choice of, whatever the thing is that we resent or regret. And how do I go forward in a way that I can respect, given that's the only choice that I have? So it doesn't mean you can't have feelings about loss, but it means you don't spend your time in the fantasy that you would be so happy had it not been for that thing, and therefore not take real responsibility for your life and go forward. What do I want to do now? How do I claim my life? It's interesting that forgiveness sometimes is so related to living our lives fully, because often we think of forgiveness as being a doormat and you pretend you're not angry about something. I've heard a lot of people who use forgiveness as a way of getting away from feelings about mistreatment and denying the mistreatment. And that's not the meaning of it. That's not, well, at least it's not a healthy meaning of it. It's not about denial. It's about being able to look squarely in the face of injustice and wrongdoing and things that hurt and tolerating that that's the life we live in. And what am I going to learn from this? What am I going to do differently going forward? And how am I going to claim my dignity and my life despite the choices that others have made that have impacted me? That's what forgiveness is. So the more we get caught in poor me, understandable, but still, the more we get stuck there, the more power we give away to the perpetrating, individual or entity. And the more you say, okay, what am I going to do with what I have? What I brought from this? I've seen so many people transform loss in these beautiful ways that they've come out of abuse or challenge or mistreatment and they've learned from it and they help others. They help others in that situation. They give more clarity, give more love to people that are in circumstances that were similar to the one that the individual regrets. So you can transform these things into something better, but you have to be able to forgive enough to move forward in a way that you respect, and you claim a lot when you do that. This person says, what can I learn from regret? I feel it a lot. Keeps me up at night, rehashing decisions I've made that I know there is nothing I can do to go back and change. This rehashing doesn't do me much good, seeing as how I don't have a time machine. So what is regret trying to teach me? Is it to think through my choices more fully, to own them more? What purpose does regret serve? Is there anything I can say to myself when I get stuck in a regret cycle, thinking through all the things I wish I'd done differently in the past? Yeah, I mean, I think it's this, I think it's, again, it's on some level a refusal to kind of tolerate the control we don't have. And it's our mind sort of thinking, if I rehash this a million times, I'm going to keep myself from a future mistake. There's some truth in that, but we're going to still make mistakes. It's also the fantasy that rehashing is like doing something. It's like very much the same muscle of worrying. If I just worry about all the things that could go wrong, it's like a signal to my brain that I'm actually doing something to keep me safe. And both of these are not doing anything to protect you from future losses. So it's like the mind's way of trying to get control of something it doesn't really have control over. Now, you can learn from regret. You can say, what is the lesson I take from this? What is the thing that I can learn from it or do differently? And it might be, there's nothing I can do, right? This was just something I did not know, and there was no way I was going to know it. So sometimes there's a moral lesson to be learned. I was too trusting, right? This person was mistreating me, and I kept thinking if I was nice enough, they would treat me better. And that's a vulnerability of mine, and I have to learn from that. And I have to stay awake to that vulnerability of mine so I don't repeat it. Okay, you can learn from regret. Sometimes you can't. I've seen people in really tough situations where they made a misjudgment, but it wasn't a moral misjudgment, and a child died, right? Or they suffered a huge loss, but it wasn't negligent. It was just that, they just weren't able to control every variable, and they suffered a big loss because of it. And the mind is just trying desperately to imagine, if I could have done that, if I could go back in time and I'd done just that, because it's the mind's way of resisting the ultimate vulnerability that we're all in, and trying to imagine I could have or should have, or somehow, if I think about it enough, I'll keep myself from future pain. And of course, we always want to learn what we can. If there is something that we can take from it, we always should, because it's a way of transforming it into something better. But a lot of times, just like Jesus on the cross, a lot of times it's just suffering with one another. That life is harsh sometimes and unfair, and that some of us have to suffer losses that we don't deserve, right? That we're not about even moral missteps. They're just about living in a deeply imperfect world, and grieving that, metabolizing that, and continuing to move forward is often very courageous moral work. And we can be kind to our minds that are always looking for control. Our limbic mind wants control. And it's good for us when it can control things, right? Climb the tree, get away from the bear, you know? That's a good thing the limbic brain does for us. But it can't control the ultimate vulnerability of living life. And so we need our courageous souls to handle that and to care about one another and ourselves living in a deeply imperfect world.
Why is it so easy to forgive other people and to see other people, like to see how they come by it honestly, but to not give that same grace to yourself, you know? Like, is
Yeah.
that an element of perfectionism, or like it's so easy for me to forgive everyone else for being human,
Yeah.
but myself, like, holy cow, you know?
Right. Well, so some people don't have that problem. Some people forgive themselves too easily and they resent others deeply. Yeah, well, I did that because you did that, you know. So your way of struggling with this isn't necessarily the way that everybody struggles with it. But I think in some ways, because we can imagine other people making missteps, in part because we're not living in the consequences of their missteps. And we are living in the consequences of our own. And so we can be like, well, yeah, you're just human, did a human thing. That's understandable. Like, what do you know, you're a good person. I can see that. But, you know, it's not necessarily affecting you. It's when you think my choices affect me or affect my children or affect my, it can be really paralyzing. Like, how do I live with that? Because it all matters so much, and it does. You don't want the ones you love to suffer. You don't want to suffer, right? And so it's just the mind's fantasy that if I'm a good person, if I think through it enough, I can avoid this, right?
Yeah.
And I get it, it's a tempting fantasy. Who
Such a
doesn't
good
want
one.
that fantasy? I mean, uh, and so it's maybe just confronting ourselves around, I just live in a world in which I just don't have as much control as I want. And it's, in some respects, it's just tolerating that. And the better we get at tolerating that, probably the more we can see the beauty in all of it and embrace the beauty in all of it. But it's not easy.
Yeah.
You know, who doesn't want the idea, do A, B, and C, and you get D, E, and F guaranteed? We all want that. But I don't know that that exists.
Any suggestions for how to approach situations where we feel decision paralysis because we fear making the wrong choice and that we'll regret it later? Relatable. How to
Yeah.
not let potential regret have power over us even before making a decision. How to not let fear of
Yeah.
future regret cloud our clarity.
Well, one thing I would, couple thoughts on that is, um, why is it hard for me to let myself make mistakes? You know, what is the meaning that's connected to that for me? Because, you know, there's this paradoxical reality that often the most successful people have the most tolerance of making mistakes. They don't beat themselves up about it. They don't say, oh, it just makes me terrible. They're just kind of like, well, yeah, you know, this is an imperfect process. I'm going to make mistakes. They don't justify, they learn from them and move forward differently. But so I think the first question is, where did I learn that that's not acceptable? Or you don't have to have learned it anywhere. Just like, what is the meaning that I give to making mistakes, and why do I find that so unacceptable? The second thing is, you know, I want to get good information. I don't want to just make decisions without information. So get all the best information I can, but understand that ultimately I just have to assert a choice without knowing precisely the outcome. And that's what life is. So it's getting better at understanding there isn't another path. It's the only way to grow is to make choices, to assert agency with less than perfect information. And we have a God that has compassion towards that. That's that's my view of the atonement, right? That it's the only way we can grow. So the more I can forgive my humanity and forgive the imperfect space in which I am growing as a human being, the more I can learn and grow from it. But again, it's a spiritual reality of learning how to forgive that, tolerate it. Again, our younger minds, and even the way many of us have been taught faith, is if you do the right things, everything works out. You know, do what God's plan is, then you won't suffer mistakes. And I understand where that comes from. That's an early understanding of faith. It's an early understanding of reality. There is truth in when you do things, you know, if you live by rules, you will generally suffer less negative consequences. But that's not the ultimate reality. You have to grow beyond that and assert agency into a world with complex choices. And that's how you grow into wisdom, line upon line. And that's the plan. That is God's plan. It's not a fail-proof, step-by-step thing that yields disappointment-free living. It doesn't exist. So the more we can see what we're actually about here, the more we can forgive and tolerate the process we're in while continuing to learn from our mistakes and having more wisdom and clarity to choose the next go around.
Question came in the chat.
Sure. If you think it's, yeah, go for it.
Sure. Yeah, it's along the lines of the next one you were going to do anyway. How do you work through the grief of regrets and mistakes, the regrets that affected others deeply? How do you work through the grief that you caused in others and self as I and others work through the regrets?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's compassion and responsibility. And back to the same theme, which I won't go over again, but the theme of forgiving the fact that we're living in an imperfect world and we're in an imperfect process. But compassion and responsibility. I care about the negative impact I have. I care about the fact that my missteps cause suffering and pain. I care about you, and I am going to do better. I'm going to learn from it. I care for how it impacted me. I don't want to do that to myself either in the future. I mean, when I work with people where there's been infidelity or something, I mean, talk about inoculating. I mean, I don't know if I'm inoculated or invulnerable to infidelity, but pretty close, because when you see what people go through, it's just such a heavy price that people pay. And people pay a heavy price with themselves, right? Like, I am not the person that I thought I was. I'm not the person that I want to be, right? And so it's compassion and responsibility. Like, I've disappointed myself, I've disappointed others, and I'm going to go forward differently. And believing in the reality of compassion, believing in a world in which forgiveness and love is a real thing. And it can heal a lot. It doesn't mean you forget. It doesn't mean that you don't understand the impact of a behavior, but you can learn from it, and it can change a marriage. It can change a soul. So we can really use our negative behaviors to sanctify something in ourselves and in our relationship, to like, there's people that have worked through really hard things, and they'll look back on these often really awful challenges in the marriage or in their lives, and with a kind of gratitude. I mean, that's maybe a little strong of a word, but they understand that this is the only way I was going to learn that. This is the only way that this was how our marriage evolved and changed. It took that kind of a crisis, and it took that kind of a wake-up call. And, you know, when we go into crisis, our brains become more neuroplastic. We get much more able to learn things. When couples come to me in crisis, as hard as it is, these are the couples that are often going to do the most significant growing because they are looking for another way. They're looking for some higher ground to climb onto and to live their lives from. And so this is often the springboard of a much richer, truer, more loving way of being in the world. So I wish it weren't that way. You know, I mean, again, who cares what I wish? We all wish it, I suppose. You know, control seems like a great thing. Not suffering seems like a great thing, but I don't know another way for us to grow in our moral development and in our capacity to love each other. You know, as Richard Rohr talks about this falling upwards, it's often in fall when our worlds sort of fall apart. The things we assumed we would get through doing X, Y, and Z are not yielding fruit. And our sense of who we are and sense of reality crumbles a bit. And we have to put it back together in a truer way. That is development. Nothing's going wrong. That's how growth happens. And so I think it's time we forgive that process because it's a divine process and nothing's going wrong, right? It's the path. It's the way we grow. So the more compassion and courage we have in the face of that fall, the better we do. Okay, so this person says, when we say or do something that we regret and can immediately feel that regret, what is the best way to address this with the other person involved? If I made a mistake or words come out wrong and I truly regret saying or doing what I said or did, what is a good way to convey that in an apology without implying that I was misunderstood? Yeah. But that what came out or what my behavior showed didn't accurately represent my real intention. I tend to over apologize and look for reassurances that I have been forgiven and that we, me, and the other are okay. But this just stirs it all up again and is self-focused. Yes, I know. Good. The only real apology is change behavior. But do you have a good words that would maturely convey sincere regret for an action that caused unintentional harm? I'm just trying to think about that for a minute. So there's the issue of intention that's in the question. And there is unintentional, how to say it? There's three ways of doing this. There's intentional harm. I know if I say this is going to really make my spouse feel bad, okay? Like we're like consciously doing something. There's how to say it? Unacknowledged but intentional harm. And then there's unintentional harm. Unacknowledged but intentional is a little trickier because a lot of times we're doing harmful things, but we're telling ourselves it's something else. I know this is a little bit of a sidestep from this question, but I just think it's important for thinking about what an apology actually is in this situation. Very seldom are we scheming, I'm going to do this, going to make them feel bad, because we have to admit to ourselves we're that evil. And a lot of us don't like to do that, okay? We don't want to just be like, you know what, I'm just going to say it exactly that way, right, hit them right in the place where they're vulnerable, and then it's going to feel great. Usually we tell ourselves it's self-defense. I was actually making a joke. You know, we have all these ways of telling ourselves what we're doing is more palatable than often what our regressive brain is in fact doing. It wants to create anxiety or pain in the other person. And so it's harder to admit to ourselves our intention to harm because we have layered on top of it a lot of self-justification. And I would say that's a typical client of mine. They're doing things that are harming their relationship, but they're telling themselves a story about what they're actually doing, which is far more justified. So, and then there's unintentional harm where you really literally are like, it just literally came out the wrong way. And you're like, no, that's not what I meant. I'm sorry. I meant this. And usually when it's fully unintentional, unless you're with somebody who is looking to be offended at all times, usually your partner tracks that right away. Like, it's like, no, sorry, that came out the wrong way. What I mean is blah, blah, blah. And you don't even have to apologize that much because they can track that you literally just misspoke, okay? That it wasn't a big deal. What is trickier is when you're saying, no, that wasn't my intention, but your spouse is getting the sense of like, but it is. but you do that a lot. You take a dig and then you say, no, you were just joking. I mean, I don't know what would be a good example of this person's question, but sometimes we do have darker intentions that we're not necessarily admitting or acknowledging in ourselves, or we're more part of the problem than we realize. And so our spouse is having a hard time forgiving us for it because we haven't really acknowledged it. And we're busy trying to get them to reassure us that everything's okay because we haven't really gotten cleaner within ourselves around what happened. Okay. All that said, let me just see if I can take up the question on its face here. So how do I apologize without implying that I was misunderstood? Well, either you were misunderstood or you weren't. But what came out or what behavior showed didn't accurately represent my real intention. Okay. Well, okay, let's say that that's true, that it's the unintentional. I think what I would just say is, I'm sorry, I can see why that sounded like that. This is what I actually mean. And then say it. Okay. Just self-clarify. And you can apologize briefly, like, oh, sorry, I can see why you thought that. What I'm actually trying to say is blah, blah, blah. And if that's true, your spouse is probably just going to accept that, like, got it. Okay. Right. Because you can map that that's really what they were doing. And I literally just misunderstood where they were going with it. If it's the second situation here where they're tracking something more problematic and you're saying, no, it's not my intention. It would probably be better to say, like, I don't think that's my intention, but why are you still upset? Let's say you say this. No, I really didn't mean to say your dress is ugly. I was genuinely trying to say that I like the one you put on first better. It just came out awkwardly. Okay. I'm trying a hard time answering the question. I think I would just leave it at that. Now, if your spouse is like, then I would say, okay, why don't you believe me? And I'd really mean it. I'd really want to understand. Okay. Why are you still mad at me? I say things in dumb ways often. I really like the first dress. My second one, I don't like as much, but honestly, you look good in that one too, if you want to wear it. Okay. You can just clarify your mind. You're showing your mind. If they're still mad, I would just say, what am I missing about myself in this? Why do you feel upset? Because then they might say, you often say these things in hurtful ways. And then when I'm upset, then you start to backtrack, I don't know, whatever. They're going to give you a view of you that maybe you need to deal with. The apology is not as important as understanding how they're experiencing you. And if there's something to understand about yourself in that interaction that you haven't wanted to see, and instead you perseverate on getting them to acknowledge your apology. So if you're fixated on getting them to forgive you, it's often about not really getting clearer and cleaner within yourself. And that's where I would put my focus. So I wish you all the best in dealing with your regrets, your remorse, and your resentment. I'm saying it like it's so funny. These are hard things.
What would if someone really struggles with this, which course would you point them to, or what other resources do you have?
I would probably go to the Strengthening Your Relationship course. It depends a little bit on the context, but in that course, I'm helping people really look at what they do in relationship when their ego demands are not being met, and how we handle our disappointments, right, in ways that create more unhappiness either in ourselves and or in our relationship. So it is a good course for really looking at, how do I handle my disappointments? And am I handling it in a way that's making my life and my relationship stronger and better? Or am I handling it in a way that's kind of self-justifying, but really solidifies my misery and the misery in the relationship? And how can I engage in a more courageous and higher integrity way because as we do, our lives get better, our relationships get better. So that's probably the course where I take it up the most directly. I'm trying to think in the mini courses, just one about infidelity that deals with it some, but isn't directly around resentment. But
I
yeah.
think the midlife crisis Q&A is a good one, maybe too.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Anyway, if you have more questions about this, I can send you podcast episodes, but that's good to know. The Strengthening Your Relationship course is a good one. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thanks everybody for coming.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.